Hi, everyone. Welcome to the mini lecture on profiling. And this will actually be kind of the last lecture-based video. We'll be moving on to serial killers starting next week, and those are just going to kind of be little mini overviews of different serial killers, and we'll start applying some of the profiling concepts there. So when we talk about psychological profiling, um, the main idea of it is drawing inferences about a criminal's personality, behavior, motivation, and demographics based on crime scene and other evidence. Right. So you are trying to look at a crime, and based upon what you are seeing and the tendencies, trying to figure out who is most likely to have done this. Right. So typically profilers are called in to really assist with the narrowing down. What is it that people should be looking for? And even though profiling gets a lot of attention from entertainment, for it doesn't necessarily work that way in real life, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone. That profiling, it's one of those things that historically we've seen work very well in some instances, and in other instances it is a complete failure. And it's because no criminal is identical to other criminals, right? It's one of the things that, again, for entertainment purposes, it's fascinating to us that we can look at these trends of serial killers and ultimately begin to understand what's going on. But the reality is like Ted Bundy versus Jeffrey Dahmer, that they're very different in what they wanted to do and kind of their mindsets while they were doing it. Um, and that holds up against any other comparisons that might exist. Now, there's some commonalities, which we'll talk about, um, that we can pretty safely say that this is most likely what's going on. But many times profilers are still caught off guard with, why that didn't show up anywhere in the profile regarding a demographic or regarding um, a major clue that they thought, and it was complete accident. The perpetrator didn't mean to actually do something like that, things like that. So when we look at profiles, they're developed by the FBI Behavioral Science Unit. There is also the Behavioral Analysis Unit. It's kind of one and the same. I think it's more so depending upon who you talk to, and um, they're going to use the BAU versus BSU. But the main idea of it is to assist investigators, right? So the way that profiles typically happen is the FBI gets contacted when there is a spree going on, or there's a really heinous case. And they're told, hey, we had this happen, not having any leads quite yet. Could you take a look at it and see if there's something going on here? And so the FBI typically does not get to the crime scene while the crime scene is still active. So instead, it's based upon police reports, it's based upon police photographs, it's based upon looking at the medical examiner's reports. It's all kind of post hoc, meaning after the fact, which again, from our entertainment understanding of profiling, the profilers are there and doing everything in real time, and that's just not likely to ever happen. Um, the idea is to emphasize the signature aspect of the crime. So, what is it that might be a big clue that a regular, detective investigator is going to miss, that they might not catch that as being significant? As it says up here, popular but not validated. And we'll get into again some of that stuff. For anybody wanting to be a profiler, you do have to be an FBI agent for a minimum of 7 years before they would promote you to the BSU. Um, this plays into kind of the nature of profiles, that you can be extremely well educated and know all of the literature about profiling. There still has to be kind of this gut instinct, and the only way to get that is to actually be in the field. So you will be a field agent for the FBI for 7 years, where they will send you wherever they need you. After 7 years, you can try to get promoted there. It's no guarantee that that's going to happen. By having master's or PhD in psychology or forensic psychology, it is a boost to say the least, but is not a guarantee that you'll eventually get there. Um, the other thing is that if you want to be an FBI agent, you have to apply before the age of 35. After 35, they will not take you. And again, this has more so to do with longevity, that by the time that you're actually an experienced field agent, which again, about 7 years, that puts you at the age of 42. If you were to say, I want to be an FBI agent when you're 40, well, now you're 47 by the time you're considered experienced, and you're probably going to be retiring in, you know, the next 10 to 15 years. It just isn't worth it. So if you're planning to do anything with the FBI, 35 is kind of the cut point before you won't be eligible. So some famous profiles, Jack the Ripper, which we'll look at him when we get to the serial killer stuff next week. But first subject of a criminal profile, not at all what we now would recognize as a criminal profile, but certainly for that era, there was a bunch of things happening, a bunch of things being publicized that would fit the idea of what a profile is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to help limit it, and police officers not very well trained in it yet. So it was a lot of just kind of random things that happen. Ironically, Jack the Ripper is very well known within kind of the criminal side of things as being one of the first serial killers to have communications with police officers. And there is great debate on how much communication he actually had. Most people do agree that he definitely sent at least one, perhaps two letters. But what happened is a local newspaper published a letter trying to get assistance from the public, and the public essentially trolled the police. They started sending in fake letters. Now, because we as a species have a hard time learning from history or assuming that history will repeat itself, if that sounds somewhat familiar, the Zodiac case did the same exact thing, that the Zodiac killer here in the States did communications with the officers. They published the letter trying to get people to help crack the code, and then they got inundated with a bunch of false letters saying that they were the killer and here's a new code and all this other stuff. And he was never caught. Jack the Ripper was never caught either. There is a fun story that it seems like a money grab to me, but I've had students bring it up, so it's well enough known. But Jack the Ripper, again, never was caught. Our first serial killer on record, at least in America, was H.H. Holmes. And there's some people that think Jack the Ripper and H.H. Holmes are actually the same person. Again, that has not been proven, to say the least. There was a book written, but the book was written by like the great grandson of H.H. Holmes, which again to me just screams that that could be a potential money grab. But nevertheless, it's a theory that's out there. Olympic bomber in 1996. There's actually just a movie released, I think last year, on this, but essentially 1996 Olympics was in Atlanta. There was a bomb that was discovered, and profile was developed trying to figure out who the Olympic bomber was. The profile said it was a security guard who ultimately found the bomb, that he was the one that planted it because he wanted to get notoriety and become famous. That was not the case. There was an actual bomber that was there who was not the security guard, and so the profile was wrong. Contrast that with the Mad Bomber of 1957 in New York. This was a very precise profile that even went down like, when the arrest is made, here is what the guy is going to be wearing, and it was correct. So I mean, that one was pretty amazing that it was that precise, but it also kind of set up this false hope that, all right, we now know everything. And bombers are um, a group of individuals that are very hard to profile. Some of you might remember that we had a serial bomber a couple years ago in Texas, and profiles were all over the place on him. The bombers are difficult because they never they can have certain targets, but as far as who the victims are, it's a crapshoot, and so that really is difficult because most of the profiles they're based upon what we call victimology. You look at the victim, you look at demographics of the victim, you look at occupation of the victim, you look at marital status of the victim, all the stuff, and you start to see patterns emerge with most serial killers. Now, again, the patterns might tell us something very different depending upon who the serial killer is, but that's typically where we're going to start. Is we're going to look at, is there any similarities across the victims, and even if it's not appearance based, which is the most common one, is there occupational, is there um, attendance, right, that they all go to the same church or the same school or whatever it happens to be. And so again, that falls under victimology. With bombers, their victimologies are scattered because we can never say that certain victims were intended, right? Like if they were mailing a bomb, we can probably safely say, okay, that victim was intended. But if it goes off early, all right, well, now what? Right, becomes kind of the narrative. Was that intentional? Was that not intentional? Things like that. So here's just kind of the flow chart process. I won't read it off to you here, but kind of the big ones to go off of, information about the crime first and foremost, looking at different possible motives. Is there robbery here? Is there, sexual assault here? Anything about the perpetrator that was left. And we'll get into sloppy versus not sloppy, or more professionally called organized versus unorganized. But about the victims is where, again, it's really going to become the heavy handed part of a profile. You then get police and expert reports in there, develop the profile, and then how accurate is it? Profiles get revised all the time as new information, new evidence comes through. It's not a bad thing, and officers are told that this profile is developed not because we think that it is golden and we want you to just focus on this. It's to help you, right? It's a tool, not the absolute. So characteristics of serial killers, again, these are very broad based, and these are just some of the ones that I tend to see more often, or ones that students have heard about. So impaired rational thinking from brain injury, yeah, it happens that a brain injury will occur, and depending upon where the injury happened in the brain, it might impact their impulsivity. And so if it's doing that, they might do things that they normally wouldn't, but they don't have the mechanisms inside to actually stop themselves. If you're born that way, you typically get labeled as a psychopath or sociopath, which, on that note, forensic psychologists, for the most part, are in consensus saying there's no difference. They just get lumped together, psychopath and sociopath. Old school, there was a difference. Psychopaths, they were ultimately um, kind of born that way, and they just cannot empathize with other people. Sociopaths, something happened in their life that ultimately caused them to not be able to empathize with other people. So again, that's the old school. Nowadays, we just say it's one and the same. And I've seen different forensic psychologists favor one or the other. But yeah, for my money, I say it's the same thing, regardless of what you're talking about. Childhood maladjustment, often animal cruelty. Again, one of the things that we do see. Now, that is not a absolute thing. So if you had a cousin who ultimately, burned ants with a magnifying glass. That does not mean that you need to be super worried that he or she's going to become a serial killer. It means that, yeah, if you're seeing that mixed in with some other things, maybe there should be a concern. And to what degree the animal cruelty is happening as well is important. What type of animals, what are they actually doing? Things like that. Um, Richard Kuklinski, who was known as the Iceman for the mob, and he gets kind of placed in as a serial killer because he fits the FBI definition. However, he doesn't do it for the typical reasons, right? Like he's getting paid money to do this, but he's unfazed by it. But he talks about stories of how he would throw cats in an incinerator, and he would. There's one famous one of him tying the tails of cats together and putting them over a clothesline, and just watching them kind of rip each other apart. Um, so like that is certainly a much higher end of animal cruelty than, again, the idea of like frying ants. Typically we see male serial killers, not saying that there aren't female serial killers, but again, if there's going to be a serial killer or killing spree, we're going to make the assumption it is a male with average intelligence. Certainly we've seen males that have higher intelligence, but most of the time it is average. Domination of victim and drug use before killing them. The drug use is typically drug use for the victim, but we have seen perpetrators use drugs as well before doing it. The drug use for the victim is typically the way of um, kind of incapacitating the victim. So whether that is just getting them very intoxicated, whether that's giving them some type of Rohypnol, which is roofies, which is the date rape drug, stuff like that, to just allow the perpetrator to do whatever they want to the victim. And typically it's tie them up, and then once the drug wears off, that's when they will actually go forward with whatever it is that they're going to do. Preference for victim type, again, we do typically see some type of commonality, but the reason for the commonality is always different, and that's important. And an obsession with violent pornography. Um, and this one, again, it's signs of a time that when we look back in the 60s, 70s, 80s era, violent pornography, getting access to it was fairly rare and difficult. And what was considered violent then is certainly shifted now because we have an abundance of availability of pornography with internet usage. And we're seeing increases in the violent nature of that. So this one, we've certainly seen in the past, I think is the best way to put it. But does it still hold water now? I think it needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. And then no characteristic list describes every serial killer. Again, incredibly important to recognize that. This is also where I will inform people, like, watching interviews and documentaries and biopics and reading books and all that stuff on serial killers is great. You have to always remember that one of the main characteristics, which I don't even have on this list because I typically talk about it in more detail in class, is serial killers are extremely manipulative. So I have seen interviews with Ted Bundy, for instance, where I have seen him blame his upbringing as being the reason he did what he did. And then I've seen a video of him saying, no, I had a great upbringing. My parents were great to me, and there was nothing wrong there. And his family life was twisted, to say the least. But he's claimed that. I've seen him blame pornography. I've also seen him not blame pornography. There's instances where people have speculated that he went on his spree because his girlfriend that he loved broke up with him, and that's why all of his victims were very similar in nature to her. And I've seen other theories that say absolutely not. Again, it's one of those things that if it's coming from the serial killer, it would be nice to make that assumption, like, yeah, this is great. Um, but most of the time, from what I have seen and what I've heard from people that do forensic psychology for a living, is that every time you talk with a serial killer, in the back of your mind, you always have to think, what are they, why are they telling me this? Right? Most of the time it's to twist the narrative, it's to intimidate, it's to do something. There's a purpose behind them telling you what it is, that they're telling you, and to do your best to not get caught up in that, and instead try to figure out what's the underlying reason here. And next week, like I said, we're not going to have kind of this lecture based one. Instead, what I'll probably do is have um, a few days that I'll do recordings on different serial killers and maybe load up some videos and just kind of give you my insights for what it's worth about, like, where can you see things not fit in, where's the body language not fitting in, right? That type of information. So this is the kind of more modern classification of serial killers. We do have a more basic one, which will come a little bit later. Both are used. So it's not as if this one, since it's newer, is ultimately used over the other one. They're used in conjunction. So visionary, psychotic, hears voices, sees visions. This is somebody who ultimately is experiencing most likely psychosis. Um, if you watch the video when we were on the insanity of Mucko, Michael McDermott, he was trying to portray himself as visionary, that he believed that he was born without a soul, and the archangel Michael came to him one night and said, we're going to transport you back to 1942 Germany, and we want you to kill Nazis and kill Adolf Hitler. And he happened to go on a shooting spree in his workplace. So he's portraying visionary, with that idea. And certainly there are people who are truly suffering from psychosis and they are actually experiencing this type of stuff. Now, it's one of the things of, is it due to drug inducement? Because that's been known to happen as well, that somebody is experiencing just a really bad drug trip, and so they do this stuff and they, kill somebody. It wouldn't probably be labeled as a serial killer, since there has to be a cooling off period and there has to be 3 or more victims, but it certainly fits that type of idea, and so it is classified because we know it has happened. It's not the typical serial killer. Mission oriented, kill people they believe are evil. So this one, we've seen, and this is much more, it's not the stereotypical serial killer as far as the ones that people, you know, find fascinating. This is going to be people who, are in positions of power and kill those that don't believe in the same things that they do. Right? Still going to be labeled as serial killers because they're killing multiple people with cooling off periods. But this is where we typically see it. Again, we could have a, person that's not in a position of power who goes around and says, I'm going to start killing X, Y, and Z because, I believe that they're evil. But it's not the main category of the mission oriented. Hedonistic, kill others for thrill. This is the big one, that people just like killing. They just ultimately find it very, they like that thrill. And they typically will not do the power oriented stuff. This is just, I'm going to kill just to kill. I'm not in it to torture. I'm not in it to do anything else. I just want to kill somebody. And then power oriented, get satisfaction from victim capture and control. This is, Ted Bundy and BTK, that they would, tie up their victims and torture them before actually killing them. Bundy would do sexual assault, BTK would not, in most instances. And so it's one of those things that, telltale sign of power oriented is, was the victim, tortured, mutilated? Was the victim tied up in any way? If it's just kind of, a quick strangulation, if it's a gunshot wound, it's probably going to be more hedonistic. If there's multiple stab wounds and missing fingers and things like that, that's going to be power oriented in most instances. Those are the two that we typically see in American serial killers, at least. So this is one of the ways that we used to do profiling. And again, we still do it. It's just that we're recognizing more and more that very rarely do you ever have a crime scene that is strictly one or the other. There's going to be elements of both of these in there. And so you need to then kind of piece together. And that's where the previous list holds up a little bit better in helping us investigate. So organized versus disorganized crime scenes, it's really about how clean the crime scene ends up being. If it's a very clean crime scene, it's probably going to be organized. If it's extremely messy, sloppy, things just scattered all around, we're going to call that disorganized. So you can kind of read the top parts there, but when we look at the characteristics down at the bottom, that's where it becomes more profile-esque. That if we see an organized crime scene, we're going to assume that the murderer is at least average in intelligence. Sorry, intelligence got cut off there. Interpersonally competent, meaning that they can have communications with people, skilled work, sexually competent. Sexually competent means that they actually understand what sex is and how it works. One of the lesser known New York serial killers, and I'm actually blanking on his name right now, but he has stated many times that he was, sought after by women, and women constantly did their best to, seduce him, and they offered themselves up for sex. And when you look into it, it's because the women that he is talking about were prostitutes, right? Like that is sexually incompetent, that they don't understand that nature of it. Inconsistent childhood discipline for the organized murderers. Controlled mood, meaning that they typically stay calm, and you can typically tell this based upon like blood splatter and everything else about how much aggression / rage were they seeing or experiencing in the moment. Precipitating situational stress. So it's somebody that recognizes that they can get caught, and so with that, we're assuming that they're stressed out when they're doing it. They don't care about the stress as much as they care about doing what they're doing, but things are probably done a little bit more hastily because there's concern of getting caught. Follows media accounts, and then high geographic mobility. What this means is that they have the ability to move around the area. So it's somebody who's probably has a car, somebody who, on top of having a car, has something to transport bodies, because many times the body is not at the actual crime scene itself. It gets transported somewhere else. For the disorganized, it's pretty much the opposite of all that stuff. And so again, I shouldn't say we can't. Very rarely are we ever going to have a crime scene that is all of one and none of the other. That there's going to be things that, we have organized in some aspects, disorganized in others. And again, it's piecing it together to try to figure out which one do we see more of. And once we can list that, so if we see a crime scene that is predominantly organized but has a few disorganized characteristics, then we can start to look at, okay, so why was there these little slip ups going on? Maybe the victim fought back, and so it wasn't as clean as what it was, which maybe then we're looking at somebody who might be anxious that during the crime, because they weren't expecting that and they let something slip. Right, that's what profilers are doing. They're doing their best to piece together everything they can, and they're making assumptions, which again, from a science standpoint, is absolutely terrible. And that's why we would never label profiling as a science, because you are using a lot of your gut instincts when you're looking at this. Here is, a mock crime scene photo that was taken from a textbook. And this would be classified as disorganized, right? There's papers thrown around. The victim is left there. There's a lot of things that people, when I show this in class, I typically give them, like 3 minutes or so to come up with a narrative. What happened here? And then try to develop a profile for, okay, who are we looking for? And this would be, again, something that profiler is going to look at and do their best to look at every little tidbit that they can to figure out what's going on. Now, in a disorganized crime scene like this, they're typically going to go with, all right, it was spontaneous, that it was not a planned out attack, because just things are so scattered that it doesn't look like somebody was calm, and certainly the person did not clean up the crime scene afterward. So odds are there's some amount of kind of residual evidence there. But if it's spontaneous like this, we're probably going to make the assumption that it's a known perpetrator to the victim, especially if nothing later on is found out to be taken. And then, again, it's narrowing down. Not saying it absolutely is somebody known to the victim, though. Again, it's just saying based upon what we're seeing in the photos and the nature of everything, that's our best guess. So you probably want to look at, maybe we see a wheelchair there. Maybe there was some home assistance, and maybe that person got fed up with something, or who knows what could have happened. But that's the profiler's job, is to try to develop this narrative from what they see. So research on it, ultimately, we do see some differences in trained profilers and other groups, but only for sexual offender cases. And so this was in 1990. Since then, there's been more research looking at other things, and we see that it's pretty much less than 50% correct when profilers do it. No discernible demographic resemblance between criminals who committed very similar crimes. Another study found in 2002. Now, research is ever changing, right? And that's the whole point of doing research, is that we can't just say, well, in 1990 we found this, so that must still be true in 2020. No, things change, and certainly things change in profiling as well. We're still seeing that 50% accuracy rate hold up, and we're still seeing that demographic resemblance between criminals are not really there. That somebody who commits murder does not look like the next person that commits murder. That there's their own unique purpose and reason for doing what they're doing. It would be great if we can match them up, certainly, but it would be a major error to say we now understand why somebody murders somebody else. We don't, because we can develop a long list of here's potential reasons, but it won't explain every single murder, right? Like we need to understand that, and that's how we can actually grow with this. So problems and promise here. Basic assumptions are not validated many times. Cross-situational consistency is suspect. So again, this is just saying when we look at similar situations, is there consistency between them? And again, many times it's not there. Ambiguous and general speculations remain, and this is for anybody who is looking at profiling, and even profilers. Like, I've never met a profiler who says absolutely this is the truth. Most of the time they say, yeah, I'm doing this to try to give guidance, but there could be a new piece of evidence or something that I missed in the photo that changes the whole profile. It can, and this would be a problem, result in tunnel syndrome, right? So the idea that a officer only looks at the profile and says, all right, this is the only thing that I'm looking for, and the profile is wrong. And again, it's happened many times over. And profiles are sometimes based upon stereotypes. And with this one, just some kind of clarifying. So almost all profiles are based upon stereotypes from a social psychology standpoint, right? Stereotypes are saying it's a cognitive shortcut that we say, if this is there, then this is likely to be there as well. Like, that's the very nature of profiling, or yeah, the very nature of profiling. Why I have are sometimes based on stereotypes is because it does get into racial and gender stereotypes as well, that aren't founded. So just to try to clear up that a little bit, that yes, profiling with the way that psychology typically, defines stereotypes, that's what it is that you are stereotyping the crime and the perpetrator of the crime. But we run into problems when those profiles are based upon, just strictly gender or race stereotypes. So then we get into the way the UK does profiling, um, which is geographical profiling. So instead of, and I shouldn't say instead, the US and the UK both do profiling similar. It's just a matter of which one comes first. In the US, we typically do perpetrator profiling first. In the UK, they typically do geographical profiling, which is where they look at where the crimes have happened. Now, in order to do this, you need to have multiple crimes occur and match them up and say, all right, I believe that this crime and this crime are connected as the same perpetrator. But by doing that spatial mapping, you can then start to limit down the zones. And see, won't get into. So here is kind of a graphical representation of the zone. So each dot represents a crime that was committed. And you can see you have the red zone, orange, yellow, and then kind of these outlier ones. What this typically tells us is in the red zone is most likely where you're actually going to find the residence of the perpetrator. Again, not always, but most of the time, somebody who is committing crimes, they're going to commit the crimes predominantly in areas that they're very familiar with, that they know, that the patterns of the people. They might even know the patterns of the police. They know where there's heavy traffic versus light traffic. They know um, when people are typically at home versus at work, things like that. Whereas when you go into other neighborhoods, you're probably not that familiar with it. And so, you branch out slightly for different reasons is what the UK style profiling suggests. But where the red zone is where, again, we're going to really think that's the focal point. That's where you're going to find the perpetrator. Here, called GeoMap, just kind of showing it with a map overlay. So yeah, absolutely. We would be looking right in this area predominantly for anybody that has any type of police record, anybody that's had calls of suspicious behavior on them and lives within this area. That's going to be the first go-to for the UK style of profiling. It's not nearly as exciting because it literally is you're just running a bunch of statistical algorithms in the background based on the locations of where these incidences happen. But it does, based upon the numbers, pan out a little bit better than doing the perpetrator profiling. This I already kind of talked about, so just again for time's sake, we'll kind of skip over that. And last thing, psychological autopsies. So this is done, I've seen it mainly with school shooters. This is an amateur one that was on Columbine, but despite it being an amateur one, it's pretty good. But it's the idea that after somebody commits a crime, and autopsy here, meaning they're dead, you then kind of dissect them psychologically to figure out, okay, what happened, right? So obviously it'd be great if we could figure this out before they do it to perhaps prevent the crime from happening, but doing it after the fact might give us insight. And so when we look at the Columbine one, for instance, there's a bunch of kind of misinformation. There's a bunch of misinformation on the Columbine killers and how they were treated in school and why they did what they did and all this stuff, and it funnels in from just massive amounts of media attention to it, and rightfully so, because we hadn't seen something like that. And so Columbine happened in 1999. There were certainly mass shootings in schools before that. And actually, with the younger kids, there was one that I want to say was a 12 and 13-year-old shot up their school, but it didn't have the same number of casualties, and it didn't have the same kind of thought out process. And Columbine is also considered by many to be kind of the turning point when we look at school shootings. That in the 1980s, we had a bunch of school shootings, which at that time were classified as a shooting that just happened at school. It was typically single target, meaning that there was some type of confrontation that happened and somebody brought a gun the next day, shot the person they had a fight with, and that was it. In the early 90s, we started to see this small trend of what's known as rampage shootings. So the idea that somebody just goes in and just shoots randomly at students and teachers, and there doesn't seem to be a true target. In 1999 is when we saw the shift from kind of it predominantly being single target to it predominantly being mass target. And that's the way we see school shootings happen now as well. It also was one of the first times that we saw the shooters commit suicide. Before that, the shooters typically were caught and brought in, and would be investigated and interviewed. With Columbine, we didn't have that they killed themselves before that could actually happen. And so when we look at again school shooters moving forward, we typically see that happening again, not always, but it certainly became more of a trend after Columbine that they would commit suicide after doing it. So the autopsy is essentially trying to get at what's happening psychologically. And so they break down different interviews and different statements by um, different interviews and statements made by family members, neighbors, all that type of stuff. They break down any writing, so if they did journaling, and they try to figure out what is going on inside the mind. Why did they also go forward with it, right? Like, it's one thing to have them fantasize about doing it, but to actually go forward, what was the tipping point there? And so that's where psychological autopsies come in. Typically, like FBI profilers aren't going to be the ones doing this. This is probably going to be more clinical psychologists that are doing the autopsies, and they've been asked by police or by the government to do it just because, or it's a money grab as well, that you have a psychologist who decides, I'm going to do a psychological autopsy on this person, and they write a book on it and try to make some money as well. It's not the nice way of thinking of them, where they're actually not trying to help anybody except themselves. But I would be lying if I said that doesn't happen. So when we talk about profiles, so we'll kind of stop that. There's just some commonalities, and again, next week we'll go over different things. I'll have just kind of different characteristics of perpetrators and show you, like, all right, here's how this matches up. But some very general ones. Typically, the race of the victim is going to match the race of the perpetrator. Again, not always that case, but most of the time we see that happen. If the person was manually strangulated, strangulated with hands, it is most likely going to be a male perpetrator. It takes a tremendous amount of strength to do that. And it's also going to tell us what the size of the perpetrator. If they are using some type of assistance to strangulate, so some type of rope or tie or something like that, again, it's probably going to tell us man, because women typically don't kill that way. The way women typically kill is through poison from a serial killer standpoint. Now, there certainly are some that have chosen like firearms as well, but strangulation typically is not the way that women are going to kill. So if we see strangulation, we're going to assume it's a male. If we see something tied around their neck, we're going to assume that it's a male of smaller than average stature. If it's we see the handprints. We're going to assume that's a male of larger stature. That will change if the victim is bound. So if the victim is bound and we see, handprints, we're probably again assuming it's a male of, smaller stature, because they had the victim bound, so the victim couldn't fight back anyway. So again, these are just kind of some of the commonalities that we use to narrow it down. Now, doesn't mean that it's always right, but when you're looking at profiling for your paper, those are the things to consider is, um, was strangulation there? What's the race of the victim? Obviously, if there's sexual abuse present, that's going to be a telltale sign as well of, some characteristics of the perpetrator. Trying to think if there's any last quick things. Guns are rarely used for serial killers, at least the ones that we typically know of. Certainly, you have like Son of Sam, who used a gun. But again, most of the time, if there's a gun being used, it's going to be early on that they just don't know how to go about killing, so they don't have kind of this MO set up. There's exceptions to that as well, like Edmund Kemper, ultimately strangled at first, got a gun later on, and then used a gun, which he breaks a lot of the rules that I just went over because he was like 6'9", just a massive guy, and he would still use different things to strangulate his victims despite being much larger than them, and then again would use a gun later on. Stab count is always important if the knife is what is used, to count how many stab wounds there actually were, and the locations, because that's going to be very important for us to understand, like what was happening here. Was it just to kill the person, which would then put them under throw kill, or was it to torture them, which would ultimately be under hedonistic? And that based upon where the stab wounds are. If you get a whole bunch of stab wounds on the leg and arms, okay, that's not going to be fatal, and just by itself. So they are torturing in most cases. And obviously, if the person has rope marks and other things like that, we can certainly piece together a narrative. So just again, we'll go over more of these things next week, but just to kind of start putting you into a little bit of that mindset of like, when you see how the person was killed, immediately you should start thinking about why were they killed this way, right? And many times it is physical in nature, or it's a lot of serial killers, and you'll hear this in the videos we'll watch next week, is I like to watch the life leave their eyes, and so that's why I strangled them. And yeah, that sounds, for lack of a better term, poetic from their point of view. Um, Most of the time, it's not that. Most of the time, it's power, right? And that's how we can kind of sum up most crimes, honestly. When we look at sexual assault, it's about power. When we look at, somebody who's doing serial killing, murdering, it's simply about power, having power over somebody else. And so it prolongs it the most, right? Strangulation, because you have full control over when that person dies. So it's not about watching life leave or anything like that. It's about having full power over somebody else, which again is helpful from a profiling standpoint, because we're starting to figure out, like, okay, why is this so important, right? What is happening in their life or in their childhood that they felt like they never were able to have any power over anything? And that becomes very important, right? So the strangulation, while the most common kind of tactic used, is also one of the most telling, because we begin to understand them much more. A knife, somebody gets stabbed 56 times. Okay, it doesn't give us much information about that person. Same thing with a gunshot, right? But the strangulation, it does. It gives us more psychological background into what is happening. So yeah, with that, hopefully you enjoy the rest of your week. It's always awkward to talk about this stuff and then kind of end with like, All right, hopefully you have fun with the material. But yeah, any questions about anything, let me know.